My dad is a pastor, so we talked about a lot of things very openly in our house. Sex was not one of them. I got a book, or I call it the instruction manual, right? I look at this book, didn't know half the things are possible until my parents hand me this book and then walk away and leave me there.
Welcome to Sex Plus Christian Parents Podcast. I'm Jason, the Executive Director for Project 619.
And I'm Thomas, lead pastor of Shiloh Hills Fellowship. And in this podcast, we will seek to equip and empower parents to be the authority in their home regarding sex and sexuality in relationships.
What I love about today's episode is that we've got parents. In past episodes, we've had some experts. This one, we have experts in the field, parents. And I think it's really important for our listeners to even hear a little bit about our background as parents.
That's right. I think parents get overlooked, but we are on the job 24/7 and often ill-equipped. And so I know for me, having two small children, one 7 and one 4, we're really beginning to navigate this going, oh my goodness, we've already lost some time maybe with our daughter. How do we catch up and equip her for what's to come?
Yeah, it's so crazy to think that we might have already missed opportunities when they're that young.
I know.
Yeah, my kids are 7, 5, and 3, and we're in the midst of just some great opportunities for conversation. And that's why I'm so excited that we have Marty and Charese that are joining us today, who are parents of children that are a little bit older than ours,
right,
but have walked this journey.
That's right.
Let's take a listen.
Oh yeah, so Marty Gonzales, I married up 10 different ways. Love of my life, who gave me 2 beautiful daughters. So I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old who are just an absolute joy. And this journey of teaching them to love Jesus and love people has been pretty exciting, but not without its challenges.
I am Charese Pettis. I am the Children's Ministry Director at Downriver Church in Spokane, Washington by day. And I am a mother to 4 children. I have an 11-year-old son and daughters that are 9, 8, and almost 7 right now. And it is a joy to teach them scripture and that God loves them uniquely and that they are built for a purpose. Even as children, it's not something that they have to wait to grow into as adults.
To begin the conversation, we asked Marty and Charese what conversations around sex looked like in their homes growing up.
I don't ever think my parents ever sat me down for a "this is sex" talk. However, they created a culture within our home of open dialogue, of you always come to us with any questions you have, and of a running conversation, not only of things regarding sex, but things regarding identity, things regarding God's design for your lives. And it started as a young age where they talked a lot about just God has a plan for your life, and it grows into how that works with each age, if you will. So as I grew, again, I don't think there was ever one specific sex talk, if you will, but it was a constant dialogue on a greater purpose, and that included sex in that greater purpose.
And now we'll hear from Marty, who at the beginning of the podcast mentioned that his conversation about sex with his parents were a little different. Even though his dad was a pastor who wanted to equip him for life, his first introduction to sex was nothing more than an instruction manual in a closed room. Listen as we pick up where he left off.
So I'm in this kind of ball of confusion in my head, right? As a young man looking and going, okay, I'm innately very curious about this. And my parents said we talk about everything, yet they were unwilling to have this conversation with me. And as I share, that led to lots of, less than desirable decisions in my life.
This is actually really important to point out. Did you know that kids whose parents talk to them about sex are far less sexually promiscuous? In fact, those that are religious, it's said that they are less likely to talk about sex in their home. I think this is a lot of what Marty experienced growing up. In fact, listen further as he dives into the impact this had in his own life.
But really led me going back to this cycle of guilt and shame, right? Not really understanding this blessing that God has given us to create life. And so for me, it was always this weird paradigm. And I'm not sure how that leveled out with the rest of my siblings, honestly, over time. I've never sat down to really ask them. But I know for me, it felt like this really taboo topic. And then growing up in the church, I understand the pressures that my dad had as a pastor. I certainly felt them as a child. But it would have been nice to just have that open dialogue that Charese is talking about and be able just to confidently, openly speak about it and understand, again, that blessing that you have and not feel like it's this shameful act or something shameful. Because I look at my parents and I'm thinking, you have 5 kids. Can't be that bad, right?
So when we're silent on sex, we can communicate things we don't intend to, like the idea that sex is inherently evil and shameful. I wonder how many of you have similar stories of silence from your childhood, especially if you were raised in a church. Thankfully, though, many parents are now looking back to learn from their parents' mistake and having these conversations with their kids now.
Man, this is so true, Thomas. But the fact of the matter is, it can be difficult. This conversation can be extremely difficult. There's a reason many of our parents didn't breach the subject in their homes. And there's even a possibility that it's more difficult now than ever before. Charese actually had something to say about this. Listen as she answers my question, is it easier or harder to talk about sex with your kids now than it was in the past?
I'd say yes to both. I think it's harder to cover comprehensively every topic that I want to cover with my kids because their attention span isn't that great. There's too much going on in the world to cover with our kids, but it's easier because the conversation has to be constantly open because they're bombarded from every angle.
Currently set at $1 million, $500,000 for the murder of Angela.
So there's always a new way to approach every conversation with my kids regarding sex and sexuality, because when you're watching the football game and commercials come on, there's something to address regarding the topic of sex. And so it's almost easier in a way that it opens doors, but it's harder because there's so much content and such topic overload, if you will, that I'm still trying to process how the world has changed in ways. How am I supposed to teach my children in a way that is honoring to God, how to protect their hearts, their minds, how to live with integrity, and how to see God in things that the world has perverted so much.
And I couldn't agree more. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's easier in some ways because it's so prolific in society, right? Yeah, you see it everywhere, every second of the day. I mean, I'm amazed at things that pop up on television, things that my kids have to see that I never crossed my mind, right? Or even crossed my path until I was well into my teenage years. So I look at it from that aspect that it's so relevant in society that there are ample opportunities to have that conversation. I think the difficulty goes back to how much and how soon.
Yeah.
A lot of it is, we could sit and talk about this all day, every day. I want to engage my kids in a way, though, that it's meaningful and it's not me talking at them, which is, in essence, giving them a book, right? Like it was for me. Let me sit and tell you everything in the world you need to know. So it's this kind of organic process of how far do I push it? How much do I share? How do I really establish that baseline of, as you said, living with integrity? Understand this gift God gave you. Understand the value of it and the beauty of sex. But not giving you so much that you do what most kids do, ball up, right, in this really kind of, what we call it, shameful or embarrassment, and not respond or engage back with your parents.
Marty brings up a good point. It's not only what we share, but how we share it. Listen, as a pastor for over a decade and 2 years into my current church, I got to tell you, I think about this all the time. When are we talking about the topic? How do we address it and equip all of our members of the church to be able to navigate this issue? Listen as Charese shares one way that she and her husband use TV watching to graciously point their kids back to the beauty of God's character, His grace for them, and His plan for their lives. Here's Charese.
I feel like we have a lot of conversations when we're watching TV, commercials come on, even just, I think there was one recently that we try to teach our kids abstinence as a form of just protecting your heart, because God knows what's best for your heart. And it's not a rule that is trying to keep you down. It's not oppression. It is a gift that God gives us because He sees the bigger picture than we see. And so in teaching that, we saw a commercial recently and there was a proposal, but there was a kid in the picture as well. And we recognize that that is so common in today's society, that there's a child before marriage and all that. And teaching my kids that, that wasn't God's plan, because God sees the bigger picture, that baby needed a mom and a dad at the beginning of her life. But look at how God redeems this. And it just tends to be a constant conversation in everything we see about God's plan, God's redemption, God's grace, and God's love, and how each of us need to continually be turning our hearts back to Him to stay in that.
Now, here's something I think it's important for us to mention. In this episode and in previous episodes, I know we'll say a lot of things and it seems like we're criticizing or bashing our parents or the generations before, but that could be further from the truth. Instead, I want us to realize that parenting, it's hard.
It's absolutely hard. And we have to be able to recognize that as we step into these conversations, we have to give ourselves grace and the generations before us. Because the reality is we're most likely going to make mistakes as we dive into these conversations.
Listen, my wife and I have said we're going to save up not for college fund, but for therapy fund for our kids because they're going to have to figure some of these things out as we're doing the same ourselves.
Absolutely.
So regardless of how much self-awareness and hard work you put in, remember, it's not that you won't make mistakes, but you will. Be comfortable. God has grace on your life, and we're going to continue to do the best we can by His Spirit.
I will say, going back to what I was just saying about the idea of teaching God's grace in everything as well, we didn't always do that. And I realized at one point that we had unintentionally introduced some major judgmentalism into our kids. Like really judging other people that have made such terrible decisions and realizing that, no, we need to redefine that all of us make mistakes. And do we choose to live in that or do we choose to turn back to God in those mistakes? But it's been a major, I think it was about 3 years ago, we really had to readjust how we were approaching these conversations because we realized we don't want our kids to be judgmental towards anyone. We want them to approach everybody with grace and love. And so we had to readjust how we were teaching everything.
What Charese brings up is really insightful. Oftentimes, we can overcorrect when trying to lead differently than our parents. This ends up creating a cycle of dysfunctional habits and patterns that cause us to eventually end up back where we started.
One is just waiting too long, assuming my kids weren't going to see the things we try to hold them back from. Yeah, I think by the time we realized that it was time, it was already a little too late, to be honest with you. I think the second, and this ties into exactly what you were saying. I think for me, there's this spot where I use a lot of questions with my kids, right? I'm a very opinionated individual, but I want my kids to kind of get led there on their own. So often, we'll see a commercial, we'll see a circumstance, and I may ask, and particularly my 12-year-old, what do you think about that? What do you feel about that? And it leads to these great conversations that are led by her. And it's not always dad talking at her.
One of the best things we can do is just enter into the world that our son and daughter lives. We do this by simply watching what they're watching, maybe playing the game they're playing, and then asking really good questions about what they're seeing, what they're hearing. This helps a ton. Listen further as Marty explores this more.
I think in that process, what it's helped me do is step away a second from my own judgments, my own prejudices, all those things that I have in my mind, right? Those constant assessments we live in, and give my kids a chance to see something, but understand how I can still love people. Because at the end of the day, it goes back to my kids, everything they do. Love Jesus and love people. So what that comes back to is people do make mistakes, and trying to make sure my kids understand that those mistakes don't define you. God's grace is still there in the midst of all those challenges, all those mistakes. We've seen it in our own family, right? If I go to my extended family, my sister, decisions they make, but God still loves you despite that. And I think it's such a phenomenal teaching tool for your kids to understand that it's not our job to do that. It's not our job to point out the inadequacies, the deficiencies. It's our job to love that person despite that, but love them so much that that person looks at us and goes, why do you do that? And we get to go, it's because of this God that loves me unconditionally. And so I think for me, as we start to kind of dissect this a little bit, again, with my kids, it's having that conversation with them and going, hey, what do you see? But despite that, how do you continue to love?
A question I've often wrestled with is how best to begin having these conversations with our kids. If entered into too quickly or incorrectly, we run the risk of shocking and potentially desensitizing our children.
I think it's really picking your spots, right? Like anything in life. I'm a pretty passionate individual, so I can get pretty excited about a lot of things. It's picking your moments and which ones are going to be the most impactful. And sometimes, honestly, I think that means listening. It means watching your kids and observing their nonverbals. How do they respond to things? I could go through the course of my day. On the way here to work this morning, I saw a number of things that trigger from billboards on down the line, right? Commercials on TV this morning. There's a million opportunities, but how do you select the ones that are most meaningful? And not just meaningful to me, but meaningful to my children. So again, that's why I go back to the ability to ask questions, slow down and say, hey, what'd you think about that? How do I not sit down and have a 45-minute conversation when my kids are going to check out in 2 minutes, right? So how do I pick those meaningful spots, have meaningful conversation, but leave a lot of room for them to be able to talk back and respond to me? Because like any of us, if it's one directional, we all shut off pretty quickly, right? So how do we engage our kids in a way that's meaningful and conversational?
This point is vital. We all know that 90% of communication is nonverbal. As Marty touched on, it's a way we engage our kids. We can listen and watch and see what they're doing with the nonverbals. Do they seem like they're in a good place to have a potentially uncomfortable conversation? Charese had a great story to share about this very thing.
Just recently, this last week, at one point, something came on the TV and I saw my 11-year-old son just kind of
Yes.
shudder almost, he had this physical like, oh, I'm not comfortable with this. And he walked out of the room, and it didn't have to be a really serious, long conversation, but hey, I'm really proud of you. You saw that this wasn't a healthy thing and you made the choice to walk away. Was enough at the moment, picking your battles. You just need a couple sentences sometimes to drive the point home. Yes. It's like in any big debate, how you've got a really final statement, that's your summary. Sometimes you only need 2 sentences to say, God's doing a work here and I can see that and I'm proud of you.
Absolutely. I think that's so key. I love the way you describe that. Because I think you can see it. You can see this emotional, visceral response to things that upset them if we slow down enough and just are present, right? Which in a day and age is a difficulty for us all, right? We have devices, we have tech everywhere. But just to be present with your child, sometimes it's as much as going, I admire that decision you made, right? And just acknowledging how proud you are of them in that moment for living the way that God wants them to live, living the way you're trying to raise them. But again, I go back to the baseline of also acknowledging they're going to make mistakes, right? I'm big with my kids, and we talk a lot about God's grace is always going to be there. I'm always going to love you. Mommy's always going to love you. And when you fail fast, right? Get down, get up, dust yourself off, and keep moving forward. Those are 3 resounding pieces in our house that we push with our kids. And that leads to some of this bigger conversation is you're going to make mistakes, but I admire so much how you handle yourself in that moment there, knowing there's future challenges to come.
In addition to watching your kids' body language and nonverbals before having a conversation, Charese mentions it can be very helpful to establish a specific time daily to talk to your kids. This creates consistency and at least guarantees opportunities for good conversation.
Specifically with us, we really engage at bedtime with our kids. And I know that's a really hard time of day because everybody's tired and everybody wants to just be done. However, we found that it's a really beautiful time to just sit with our kids and take 10 minutes and do a quick heart check. How's your heart right now? Where are you struggling? And that's whether it's regarding conversations of sex, sexuality, whether it's regarding conversations of pride and arrogance, or personal failure, where we've messed up in the day, asking for forgiveness from one another if needed, and then taking it to God together in prayer. And I've got 4 kids, so yeah, that takes 40 minutes at night, but really engaging about 10 minutes with each kid to just check in and end the day on a note of knowing you are loved. No matter what happened today, you are loved not only by me, but by our Father in heaven, and Daddy at home, and you are cared for and you are seen and you are known. And because my kids get that moment of the check-in, there's a lot more openness and honesty within the conversations, I think.
Parents, we hate to break it to you, but your kids already know you're not perfect.
I know. Meeting daily with your kids can provide a healthy opportunity for you to confess when you've made a mistake and pray together. We can create these patterns of repentance and forgiveness in our homes.
This is a hard thing to do because oftentimes we have to wrestle with our own junk to get our kids and our families to this place, but it's one that is truly rewarding when we all get on the same page.
It also is an opportunity as parents, I think, to be able to share our failures, right? How many times I come to my kids and said, hey, Daddy didn't do that right today, or hey, I made a poor choice today. And it gives me a chance to lay it at their feet and go, pray with me and forgive me. Like that's such a blessing and a gift I didn't have in my house growing up. But that's something special, right? Because I look at my kids respond and go, it's okay to be broken. It's okay to not be perfect. And I go, no, we're not expected to be, but we have this all-loving God that is. And we get to every night rest our heads in bed knowing that he loves us more tomorrow than he did today. And it's mind-boggling.
And to teach them that mom and dad do our best to parent you in a way that honors God, but we're not perfect. And we're flawed individuals. And as much as we seek after him, we're still seeking. And so we're on a journey together as a family. And I think when kids have buy-in with anything, they're far more engaged and far more willing to sacrifice for it, and to really lead in that moment as well. And so when they're engaged as a member of the family and not just a little minion that's being bossed around by an authoritative figure, they're more engaged in everything else too.
Sometimes it helps to hear from other parents. I know that on this podcast, we've brought on experts, and hearing a word from them can be really helpful. But so too can hearing a word of encouragement from parents that are doing the same thing as you. Listen as Marty and Charese share a word of encouragement to help you move forward in this conversation.
I want parents to be courageous in this conversation. I want parents to be joined in this conversation, all right? Mom and dad. I want them to be open to understand the differences and the things our kids face every day, understanding how different they were from my childhood, which doesn't feel like a long time ago, but I'm getting a little bit older. So I think you look at those pieces like that, I want us to have this openness, but I want that to transform the church. Again, I go back to loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself. If we're to do that as a church body, as Christians, as people who love God, we need to start with our kids.
Yeah.
Teach them to respect their bodies, respect this gift that they're given, protect their hearts, and trust God to do the rest. But in that process, it is also on us as human beings that love Jesus to accept the mistakes of others and continue to love. That's how we shift this paradigm on the earth. That's how we bring people back to God, is we become this group that's accepting, but hold people accountable. And I think when you look at this conversation about sexual integrity, that's what it is for my kids. You're going to make mistakes, but I'm going to love you, and God loves you even more than I do.
I would encourage parents to be willing to do hard work to rewrite your legacy. Everybody wants to have a mark. When they leave this earth, they want to have left a mark, right? Everybody wants to leave a legacy. And you hear about it in music, whether Christian or secular music. You're hearing people wanting to leave a mark, leave a legacy. But it's really hard to rewrite your history. And so if you came from a background where any topics of sex or sexuality were taboo or off limits, it's hard to break that. It's really hard to change that, but it's so necessary to do the hard work because you're creating a legacy within your children, and it is something that will last for generations, and you want to give them the tools that maybe you didn't have. So be willing to do the hard work to create something better than maybe what you would have experienced in your own childhood.
These conversations are so helpful, and we'll have more of these in future episodes. We're so grateful that you joined us here on this podcast.
Do you have any questions or topics you'd like us to discuss in a future episode? Hit us up on social media.
I'm Jason.
And I'm Thomas. And we hope you'll join us for the next episode of Sex Plus Christian Parents podcast, coming soon.
This podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people at Project 619. This episode was edited, produced, and sound designed by our very own Corey Crawford.